ladies and gentlemen, we'll commence this evening's event. Just before I kick it off, as I did say, we're absolutely jam-packed tonight, so if you're sitting on a seat with a couple of spare seats next to you, feel free to shuffle across so as many of the spare seats as possible are sort of near the aisle, because we will have people walking in for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and if you'd prefer not to have them squishing in front of you when you're trying to watch our guest speakers, do any shuffling along you can do easily now. Good evening and welcome, one and all, to this University of Sydney Science Forum on the topic of how to age well. My name's Adam Spencer. I'll be your MC this evening. Really excited to be here to watch these four amazing academics pick apart this incredible topic. Before we get on to formalities, can I start by acknowledging that the land upon which we're meeting today is land traditionally under the custodianship of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And while we think of the University of Sydney at the ripe old age of almost 170 as being an ancient structure in terms of European settlement of Australia, it's important to dwell on the fact that for not hundreds or thousands, but tens of thousands of years before anyone even thought of a University of Sydney, the Indigenous folk of this country were living, existing, discussing, arguing, swapping ideas, passing on learning in a tradition that dates back probably further than any human continuous tradition on earth. We acknowledge that and thank them for their custodianship of the land upon which we meet tonight. To discuss the topic of how to age well. I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by this topic. I just a few weeks ago turned 50. And I know when I say that, I know the first thought that goes through my mind is, oh, come on, no. And the truth, and this is, I've had no work done at all. This is all natural. But I think most people around the age, but most people, I think, I'm fascinated by the ageing process. Watching it occur in other people, as it doesn't happen to me, I just find it amazing. And I can't wait tonight to hear the thoughts of our panel on the topic of how to age well. Throughout the evening, I'm going to be watching Twitter because as people say things here and you think, gee, that's just made a question explode in my mind, the best way to make sure, or to the likelihood that your question gets asked, is hop on Twitter and hashtag Sydney Science Forum. Tag a question or a comment with that. I'll see it on the Twitter feed, and any questions I can, I'll then feed into our question and answer session at the end of the night. There will be handheld microphones going around, but I can assure you not everyone who wants to put their hand up and ask a question will get a chance to do so. That's what happens when you've got 1,000 people and a panel like this. So if you want your question to have the most chance of getting answered, feel free to fire it off on Twitter under the hashtag Sydney Science Forum. If you just want to share in the conversation, put quotable quotes out there, catch the magic of the evening, you can use Sydney Science Forum on any other social media as well. Whatever your social media of choice might be, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, Tinder, we don't care. Get it out there. If you're laughing, that's a reflection on you, ma'am. Get it out there and keep the conversation going through the rest of the evening as we hear from these four, count them, four wonderful panellists, and I have it written here on my sheet that they will stand and wave to the audience. I didn't write it, but it's here as I introduce them. From the School of Life and Environmental Sciences, Faculty of Science, and the Centre for Education and Research on Ageing, our first speaker tonight will be Dr. Samantha Solon-Biet. Give them a wave, Samantha. Give her a round of applause. After that, we'll be hearing from the Institute of Musculoskeletal Health within the School of Public Health, Associate Professor Anne Tiedemann. Taking the crucial third spot this evening, as they say in AFL parlance, the Premiership Quarter from the School of Psychology within the Faculty of Science and the Brain and Mind Centre, Associate Professor Muireann. And just as we then turn for home and the finish line's in sight and we need someone to really bring it home, from the School of Geosciences, again within the Faculty of Science, Associate Professor Iveson. They will be our four speakers this evening, after which there will be a brief Q&A. You're most likely to get your question answered, but if you do go to hashtag Sydney Science Forum at the end of your comment or question on Twitter. To kick us off this evening, her research is focused on discovering novel nutritional interventions that delay ageing and age-related lifestyle diseases, such as obesity, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. In her groundbreaking work, she discovered that diets low in protein and high in healthy carbohydrates can delay age-related diseases, extending both health span and lifespan in a mammalian model. She's had a big week. She just moved house a couple of days ago, so she might, halfway through, just have a quick nap. But please give her a big round of applause, Dr. Samantha Solon-Biet. Hi, yours, Samantha.
Thank you, Adam. That was an amazing introduction. So, my name is Samantha, and I'm really, really pleased to see such an amazing turnout today. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the work that we do here at the University of Sydney. So before we go on the topic of healthy aging, I thought it's probably best to ask the question, what is aging? So in biology, aging is essentially the process of slow structural and functional decline. Others might say it's the process of growing older in a deleterious manner. These are definitions that I've actually read from papers. So we know that as we age, there is this dramatic increase in the risk of death. And from about 65 years old, our risk of dying is nearly double that of a 40-year-old. We also know that with increasing age comes this dramatic rise in mortality associated with age-related disease, such as cancer, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, and stroke. And again, from about 65 years of age, we really see mortalities really start to rise. So, without a doubt, aging is in fact the major risk factor for disease, disability, and death for humans in the developed world. Now, one central issue with aging is that these diseases usually come as a package. So in fact, 70% of people over the age of 65 have at minimum 2 or more of these chronic diseases associated with age. And at the moment, modern medicine is focused at the treatment of these specific diseases as they appear. But research into the biology of aging has shown us that there's another way. We now know that we can actually delay the aging process through genes, drugs, or diet interventions. And my work focuses primarily on how we can use diet to delay the aging process. Essentially, how can nutrition delay this entire aging process? So one thing that genes, drugs, and diet interventions have in common is that they all target what we call key nutrient sensing pathways. And these are really fundamental biological pathways that occur in a range of animals and have remained unchanged throughout evolution. So you will see these pathways in budding yeasts, nematode worms, flies, all manners of rodents, pigs, even non-human primates. And yes, nutrient sensing pathways exist in the human too. We are not an exception. So what exactly do these nutrient sensing pathways do? In a very broad sense, these pathways really detect two things: nutrient or energy depletion. And when they sense this depletion, our bodies turn on these longevity pathways. We conserve our energy, we don't build anything, and instead we invest our resources into recycling old material. The other pathway is activated under nutrient or energy abundance. And in this case, we have an influx of nutrients coming in. There's no need to recycle our material. And these pathways are essentially pro-growth or pro-aging. Our work here at the University of Sydney has shown that the switch between these longevity modes and these pro-growth, pro-aging modes is highly sensitive to diet. We know that they respond to energy, but not just energy or calories. We know that we can switch these pathways on and off by the ratio of proteins to carbohydrates in the diet. Using a large study taking about 900 mice, we showed that diets that were low in protein and higher in carbohydrates turned on these longevity pathways, whereas diets that were higher in protein and lower in carbohydrates switched on the pro-growth and pro-aging pathways. So in fact, we could see that these high-protein mice were much leaner. They ate a lot less. We know that high-protein diets help us curb our appetite. They had very little body fat and a lot of lean mass. compared to these mice over here who had a lot more body fat. But really, despite being a little bit fatter, they had increased lifespan, improved blood pressure, blood glucose, triglyceride levels, cholesterol, and overall metabolic health. So now you must be thinking, okay, this is the mouse, but is the same thing true in humans? Because really, why bother if we can't translate this to humans? Well, there are no longevity studies conducted on humans to date. For obvious reasons, we live a very long time. But we can take clues from some of the longest-lived populations in the world, such as those in the blue zone. Now, these blue zone populations are essentially several populations where majority of the people live active, healthy lives past the age of 100. Okay? And these include Loma Linda, California, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Icaria, and Greece, which make up the Mediterranean diet, which I'm sure you all have heard of at some point. And of course, the people of Okinawa in Japan. So if we just look at the diets of these populations, and I'll show you some examples. Let's break down what they're eating and how this might be contributing to their long and healthy lives. So if we look at Loma Linda, California, you'll see that a majority of their diet is in fact carbohydrates, vegetables, fruits, plant-based proteins, which are also high in carbohydrates, and really very little protein, so 1% fish, 4% meat and poultry. If we have a look at Icaria, Greece, again, very high in vegetables, greens, fruits, legumes, potatoes, olive oil. We know Mediterranean diet's all about olive oil. And again, very little meat, 5%, and some 6% of fish. If we look at the Okinawan people, a whopping 67% of their diet is actually sweet potato, followed next by rice, and a very, very small proportion of fish, meat, and poultry. So I think having a look at these population studies can really give us a clue into what we should be eating to have healthier lives. Of course, diet is just one factor, but it is a big factor. We can also take clues from longitudinal cohort studies, which support our hypothesis of reducing protein and increasing healthy carbohydrate intake. So there are several studies out there, but I want to show you this one very big study that was published in Lancet in January 2019. And this was called the Eat Lancet Commission. Essentially, this commission was, the goal of this paper was to take 30 world-leading scientists from all over the globe, and their goal was to reach a scientific consensus that defines a healthy and sustainable diet. And I'll just show you some of their summary findings here. And the first thing they said was, this healthy reference diet largely consists of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and unsaturated oils. Sure, we probably already knew that. You're like, yeah, that makes sense. Then the second part says, includes a low to moderate amount of seafood and poultry, and includes no to a low amount of red meat, processed meat, added sugar, refined grains, and starchy vegetables. They also go on to say, we found that with a high level of certainty, that global adoption of a reference dietary pattern would provide major health benefits, including a large reduction in total mortality. So now you must be really confused, because all the overwhelming popular literature out there is saying, shouldn't I be eating more protein to be healthier? And in fact, protein is very important. We know that we need protein for important life stages. For example, growth, reproduction. It's important for lean mass, especially in exercise. Of course, for maintaining muscle mass in old age, where we have increased protein turnover and our muscles easily break down. We also know that protein is very good at inducing satiety, and therefore is usually the first line of action to induce weight loss. And that weight loss in itself really helps prevent the progression of disease. But evidence from our work and from that of others around the globe really start to question what are the effects of long-term protein intake on health span and lifespan. We have shown that a long-term high-protein intake promotes lean mass, and that's unequivocal. But we also know that this turns on these pro-growth and pro-aging pathways that leads to accelerated aging. So what about, how then do all these popular diets stack up? And I'm going to talk you through a little bit of nutritional modeling here. So here we have how much protein in the diet there is as a percentage, 0% protein to 100% protein, 0% fat to 100% fat, and this is 0% carbohydrate, and as we come closer, it becomes 100%. Now here is what typical, what the population, the range of calories that the population eats, okay? So here we have these numbers indicate the number of calories someone has eaten. The red indicates high calories, and as the colors shift to blue, we can see that this goes down. So essentially, we see that when someone eats around 50% protein, around 45% fat, and a low amount of carbs, they consume less calories. We know that Atkins diet, yes, high protein makes us eat less. If we look at lower protein intakes to fat, we can see that if we reduce protein energy, then we end up eating a lot more. How about our recommended guidelines? So here I'm plotting what's called the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So these are the recommendations for what we should eat to prevent chronic disease. And this little shape here is what we should be eating. 15 to 25% protein, 20 to 35% fat, 45 to 65% carb. So you can see that everyone's eating really beyond the scope of what's the suggested diet for reducing chronic disease. So where do these popular diets stack up? Remember that I said that high protein diets seem to be associated with accelerated aging, whereas the lower side, below 15%, can be associated with longevity, but at the risk of eating more energy. These popular diets, let's have a look here. The Atkins diet, Paleo diet, South Beach diet, Zone. They're all very high in protein and all sit on our accelerated aging part of the landscape. How about the very popular ketogenic diet? Very high fat, high protein, very low carb. So evidence suggests that these diets, while might be very good for weight loss, will really accelerate aging. Now let's look at some of the world's healthiest populations. Again, the Mediterranean diet, Okinawans, Kitavans of Papua New Guinea, and Tsimane people of Bolivia. Where do their dietary patterns sit? Yep, you guessed it. They're in the longevity part of the graph, the green part, the lower protein intakes. So it's important to know that while they have lower protein and high in carbs, the carbs that they're eating are healthy carbs. So these are fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, seedy breads, root vegetables, and definitely not processed carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods, high in sugar, high in fat. It's very important to note that we're by no means recommending that people adopt a donut diet. So, in summary, we are really at the forefront of aging research here at the University of Sydney, and our work in mice has shown that the diet composition profoundly influences the aging process. And this has gone on to influence clinical trials that have been completed and new clinical trials that are starting, that will be starting soon. We know that nutrition is important, so I guess the question is, what do we want to prioritize right now? Would you rather live longer and stay healthier but be a little bit fat? Or would you want to lose weight and be leaner but live a shorter life? Because we know that nutrition can help achieve each of these, but not all at the same time. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, these lovely bunch of people, and I'd like to just say that if you are interested in hearing more about the biology of aging, this conference is, Australian Biology of Aging Conference has just opened up for abstract submissions, and it's going to be held here in Sydney. It's open to anybody that wants to come. You just need to register. So, thank you very much.
Great stuff, Samantha. Well done. Wonderful, Samantha. Thank you very much. If you've got questions for Samantha for our Q&A, Sydney Science Forum is the hashtag to use. Don't worry, we will be serving kilos of sweet potato. Hey, mate, I've never heard so many people laugh so loud at a list of comorbidities. That was wonderful. Samantha's going to be part of our a couple of seconds, but our second speaker is the theme leader in healthy ageing within the physical activity, ageing and disability stream at the university, who research designs and evaluates physical activity-based strategies to promote independence and prevent falls in people aged 50 plus. She's a bit of a superstar. In 2016, the importance of her research was recognised with the prestigious NHMRC Research Excellence Award. Yes, indeed. Give her a round of applause, Associate Professor Anne Tiedemann.
Okay, thank you, Adam, for that introduction. So I'm here to talk to you about something that I'm really passionate about, physical activity. And we all know that physical activity is good for us, don't we? And actually, humans have known this for quite some time. If you look at my slide, you can see a quote from Plato, the Greek philosopher. So even way back in 428 BC, people were talking about the importance of movement and physical activity for health. And since then, here at the University of Sydney and other places, there's been a lot of research conducted that's demonstrated the association between physically active lifestyles and better health outcomes. Now, you might not realise that around half of our population is actually inactive. So around half of Australians are not active enough to maximise the health benefits of physical activity. So what we have in this area is a disconnect between the evidence of effectiveness and what people actually do on a population level. So my research tries to address this by developing programs and interventions that are cheap and easy to be rolled out broadly, and that mainly support people aged 50 and over to be more active. So a bit more about the inactivity crisis that we have in our world. It's been shown that around 5.3 million deaths per year are due to inactivity. And physical inactivity has been demonstrated to be of similar importance as a modifiable risk factor for chronic disease as obesity and tobacco. The cost of this inactivity is huge. One study estimated that in 2013, the cost of inactivity was around $67 billion per year worldwide. So you can see it's a huge issue that we need to pay some attention to. And it really is crucial, if we want to age well, that we become more physically active. Now, the importance of this issue is demonstrated by the World Health Organization Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. So this was released last year. And the aim is to create a more active world. The specific aim is to reduce inactivity by 10% by 2025. And what's important to realise is that this action plan demonstrates that this problem is not down to merely personal choice. In order to make the world more active, we need to have four main strategies to change this situation. It is about our choice, so we do need to create active people and active societies, but it's also about creating environments that promote activity. And later on, my colleague Kurt will be talking a bit more about the impact of the environment on our activity levels. We also need policies and governance that promotes activity. So all of these things are important together to make the world a more active place and to promote physical activity as an easy choice. So we really need to look at physical activity as an investment in our future health. We have an abundance of research that demonstrates this. We know that physical activity reduces the risk of many chronic diseases such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes. It's also important for preventing obesity and some cancers such as breast cancer and colon cancer. It also promotes positive things like longevity, it promotes concentration, positive mood, it strengthens our bones, and this promotes independence in older age. So we know that people who are active in their younger and their middle age are more likely to remain independent for longer into older age. And it also is important for maintaining social connections in community. So what should we be doing? We have a lot of knowledge about how much physical activity we should be doing to maximise our health. So you can see the physical activity guidelines from the World Health Organization here. There's also American guidelines that were recently released, and there's guidelines in Australia. And they all basically say a similar thing. So for young children, the recommendation is that they be doing around 3 hours a day of physical activity. For children 5 to 17, the recommendation is around 1 hour a day of moderate intensity activity. And what we mean by that is activity that increases the heart rate, makes it a little bit harder to breathe. So brisk walking, swimming, cycling, for example. It's also important that children take part in activities that strengthen their bones and muscles, and the recommendation is around 3 times a week. And importantly, if people do more than this, so more time than is recommended, there's additional benefits. For adults, you can see the recommendations here, 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity activity. So we can say that's around 30 to 60 minutes on around 5 days of the week. It's also important to do strength training in adult times. For older people, the recommendations are similar. Moderate intensity activity around 150 minutes a week. It's important to build strength. And importantly, in older age, improving balance is crucial because we know that that is important for preventing falls in that older age group. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that now. So falls are a huge issue in older age, are a major public health issue. And you yourself might know someone who's had a fall, and you can recognise the devastation that that can cause. Once we reach 65, around 1 in 3 people will fall at least once every year. It's a huge number of people, and with our ageing population, it's becoming even bigger an issue. But the good news is that structured exercise and other interventions can prevent falls. So falls are not inevitable, and not an inevitable part of ageing. So my colleagues and I have recently published a Cochrane review, which is a summary of the evidence in this area, which looked at exercise interventions for preventing falls in community dwellers. We found a lot of evidence, so 108 randomised trials, and overall we found that exercise was associated with a 23% reduction in the rate of falls. Importantly, not all exercise is equal in this area. We know that exercise that challenges balance is important for preventing falls, and it must be carried out in a standing position. We need to have movement of the body, so not just standing still but moving, bringing the feet closer together or standing on one leg, and also taking away upper limb support. So really trying to challenge the balance, that's the way to prevent falls. Some of my other current research at the Institute for Musculoskeletal Health, I'm about to start a trial of yoga to determine if it's effective in preventing falls in older people. We're also looking at the role of health coaching to support older people to become more physically active. We're doing a project where we're looking at promoting physical activity to women aged 50 and over in order to maintain their independence into older age, so starting early for a benefit later on in life. And we're looking at health professional education, so trying to help health professionals with additional information and skills so that they can refer their patients to physical activity opportunities. I'm going to leave you now with some practical strategies to increase your physical activity. So importantly, you need to choose something that you enjoy. we know that if it's enjoyable, you're more likely to keep doing it. Setting goals is a really good approach to trying to promote activity. But it's important to set SMART goals. These are goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So rather than saying, my goal is to be more active, you could say, next week, I'm going to walk 3 times a week for 30 minutes, and I'm going to keep it up for 1 month. So be specific about what you want to achieve. It's important to try and create a habit. So schedule physical activity into your week and make it an important part of your week. Make it sociable, particularly with older people. This tends to be something that really helps to maintain that activity and to keep people coming back. And if you're looking for an exercise program, New South Wales Health has a website called the Active and Healthy website. And that's a listing of physical activity opportunities for people aged 50 and over. Some people find it helpful to track their activity. So wearing a pedometer or an activity tracker can help us to know how active we are and how much more we need to do. Some people find it helpful to have support. So that could be from a health professional or a health coach. And again, New South Wales Health funds the Get Healthy information and coaching service. And this is free to access and can provide ongoing support to increase your physical activity and also to improve your eating habits. It's important to start small and gradually build up. Often one mistake people make is going too hard too soon and then regretting it, becoming sore and basically giving up. So it's important to take it gradually and gradually increase the amount of activity that you do. Keep at it. We all have barriers that stop us from being active, but it's important to try and find ways to overcome those barriers and to keep trying to be active. Doing something is really important. It's better than doing nothing. So even if you can't reach the guideline levels of activity, we know that even increasing your activity levels by 10 minutes a day has a health benefit. It's worth doing it. And importantly, you're never too old to start being active or to continue being active. Age is not a reason to give up being physically active. It's actually a really good reason to be active because we know that the benefits are great. So just to summarise, physical activity has been described as the best buy in public health. It's important to try and be active on most, if not every day of the week, and to see movement as an opportunity to boost your health rather than an inconvenience. And exercise really is medicine, and if it was in a pill, we'd all be taking it daily. So I would urge you to try and think of how you can get more activity into your day and to reap the health benefits. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Anne. Great work. Thank you, Anne. True story. My mum, who's 77 now, I think, recently moved into a retirement lodge, and it's a great convivial thing, and they have all these group exercise and all this sort of stuff. And I got a phone call from the lodge, and they said, look, everything's fine. We don't want you to panic. We did have to send your mum to hospital. She was complaining of some chest pain. Everything's completely fine. And I rang mum, and they have the protocols there. If anyone wakes up and says, oh, I've got a bit of chest pain, bang, straight in an ambulance, all that sort of stuff. And I spoke to mum about it, and what actually happened was she said, remember the last time you came around here, we were sitting in that circle doing all those exercises with the weights and that sort of stuff. I was feeling pretty good about it, so I went up from 1 kilo to 2 kilos. And it turns out I tore a little muscle just there in my pectoral. So I wasn't having a heart attack. I'd actually torn a little muscle just there in my pec. And I thought, Mum, that's awesome. You're so ripped. Overtraining that you're... Oh, that's great. Too hard, too soon, wasn't it? That's what my mum did. Okay. Our next speaker is an associate professor in psychology at the Brain and Mind Centre, one of the fantastic centres at the university, where she leads the Memory and Imagination in Neurological Disorders, MIND, like what you've done there, team. As a cognitive neuroscience, she explores how large-scale brain network disruption impacts cognitive function, in particular in dementia. In 2016, she won the New South Wales Premier's Prize for Early Career Researcher of the Year. It's one of the most prestigious awards in all of research, in particular for young researchers across Australia. Please welcome to the stage Associate Professor Muireann. All yours, Muireann.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. So it's really great to be here this evening to follow on from two fantastic speakers and to talk about what we've learned so far about how we can potentially optimize our brain health and hopefully mitigate against perhaps developing something that's less ideal in terms of aging outcomes, notably that of dementia. And I think everybody in the room is probably keen to understand a bit more about what is normal aging in terms of brain health, what are risks for dementia, and is there anything that we can potentially do to buffer, or maybe to stave off this pathological process. So we know that we are all living in a world where the stats show that we have an aging population. And so the gains that we've had in terms of medicine leading to longevity, we're all living longer. These are also offset. There's a bit of a trade-off in terms of we're starting to see the product of what happens when we live longer. And so we're now aware that there are many people who are going on to be diagnosed with dementia. And in fact, there are some downsides. There's age-related decline and also some disadvantages perhaps to having increased longevity. And we know that in just less than 50 years, we're going to have quite an aging population within Australia. And so we need to start thinking about what we can potentially do to ensure that people are reaching their best in terms of brain health. So we'll start with the bad news. So just as the body undergoes wear and tear, and as we get older, we start to feel the physical effects of aging, the brain is no exception. So the brain is a physical organ. The brain is subject to wear and tear. And as we get older, there are numerous changes that happen to the brain in terms of its mass, its structure, its vasculature, and also its connectivity. So we know that our brains are starting to shrink. And this is happening actually from around the age of like 30, 35, so it's all downhill. It's all over for me. And we know that this shrinkage actually occurs in the frontal lobes of the brain, and these are the regions that are the most evolutionarily recent regions of the brain. So these control your attention, your ability to plan, and to engage in higher order and complex forms of thinking. We also observe shrinkage in the hippocampus. And for anyone who's heard this term before, this is a very small seahorse-shaped structure in the medial temporal lobes of your brain that's crucial for memory formation. So you can see that we might start to be cognitively slower, and we might actually also start to experience changes in our memory function. We know that the ribbon or the cortical surface of the brain begins to thin out as well. We know that the white matter, so these are the regions that are connecting our grey matter structures, become less effective at transmitting signals between, and so we start to lose our efficiency in terms of the information that's being relayed from structure to structure. And in terms of the chemical messengers of the brain, so our neurotransmitters, we start to see decreases in the amounts of dopamine, acetylcholine, and serotonin as well as we age. And this can have knock-on effects in terms of our cognitive function and also our mood. But I think we also need to look at the research from the other side of the coin. And so it used to be that there was quite a nihilistic view of aging and that it's all downhill, there's nothing we can do, and just the end is nigh, let's just give up. But that's not true. So I'm here to debunk some of those myths. So we know, in fact, that many of the studies that are assessing age-related cognitive processes, many of the tasks have actually been standardized on young, healthy adults. And so instantly, we're not assessing the way in which these cognitive functions may potentially be preserved or even enhanced in older age. And so when studies are actually designed in a way to measure the cognitive functions that are preserved or enhanced, what we do see is that as individuals get older, we start to outstrip our younger compatriots in terms of our semantic processing, so our ability to derive meaning from experiences. We show gains in our ability to form impressions of people. We have better socio-emotional functioning. We regulate our emotions far better than our younger cohorts. And also we have improved vocabulary, lifelong learning, and wisdom from all of those years of experience. So this idea of a downhill trajectory that's global and that's affecting all aspects of function is actually inaccurate. And there are numerous ways, numerous cognitive domains in which, when we get older, actually we're showing improved or enhanced functioning. Another key point is that aging in itself does not equal dementia. And so I think there's a common misperception that as we get older, that dementia is an inevitable consequence of aging, and this is actually not the case. But to address the fact that we are living in an era where dementia is becoming increasingly frequent, here are some of the most recent statistics in terms of the prevalence of dementia in Australia. So we know that there are approximately 500,000 individuals that are living with a diagnosis of dementia, and every day 250 more are added to those ranks. And I think there would probably be very few people in this audience tonight who've not had experience with somebody living with dementia or a family that's struggling with that as well. And I think it really is incumbent on us to start to look at what are the risk factors for developing dementia and what can we do? What can we do now today to try and mitigate or reduce our risk? So as I said earlier, aging does not equal dementia, and I want just to draw attention to these trajectories. So as I said, normal aging, healthy, living longer, healthy cognitive aging is associated with some decline, and that's perfectly normal. Dementia represents a complete deviation from the path of normal aging, and it's underpinned by known biological and neurobiological changes. So living longer does not necessarily mean that you will get dementia. It's not a foregone conclusion, but as we get older, there is increased risk of developing dementia, and so we need to understand why that is. So knowing the warning signs, I think if anybody is concerned about their memory, one of the best sources of information on dementia is the Dementia Australia website. They have a huge amount of information about the warning signs, the difference between simple forgetting or lapses, or what some people call senior moments, and actually things that you should be worried about, insidious changes that are pathologically relevant. And so just to highlight a few of those, we know that memory loss is a core feature of Alzheimer's disease, but we all experience memory lapses in our daily lives. I mean, I have 2 young children and I'm constantly forgetting what I did, forgetting where I put my keys, losing my phone. These are normal, inattentive changes in memory. I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. I'm probably multitasking. I'm trying to do too many things at once. This is not a sign or a pathological indicator that your memory is failing. We see changes in mood, misplacing belongings. These are much more important. So being confused within familiar surroundings, being confused as to the time, the date, the current year, not being aware of where you are, and showing visuospatial dysfunction. These are all cardinal features that we need to look out for in our loved ones and possibly raise as a red flag if we go to the GP. So to sort of move to a more optimistic note, in fact, it seems that there are individuals who do harbour significant amyloid and pathology in their brains, as severe as cases of Alzheimer's disease, but who do not show any overt symptoms of cognitive impairment. And so these individuals live well into their 90s, and they've been dubbed super agers. And so as the name suggests, they're actually performing at a cognitive level that is far superior for what you would expect in terms of a normal aging trajectory. And they're outperforming their peers who are 20 to 30 years their junior. And so at post-mortem, what's particularly interesting about these superagers is that post-mortem autopsy of their brains revealed a significant burden of amyloid, plaques, and tangles that are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. But these individuals never showed any overt features of cognitive decline during life. So something that they're doing, perhaps a genetic or an environmental influence, is mitigating against the fact that they have accumulated this pathology during life. And so key traits that we found from these studies revealed that they have certain personality traits that may promote a more positive lifestyle. So they show that they're optimistic, they're positive, they persevere, they're resilient, they're physically engaged, and they're socially engaged. So if we try and take some of the lessons from the superagers, how can we cultivate resilience in the face of all of these other risk factors that we know about? And so as Samantha has already alluded to, we know that there are cardiovascular risks that significantly increase our likelihood of having brain-related pathology such as stroke, which in turn is a risk factor for dementia. We need to be able to reduce hypertension in midlife, diabetes, our cholesterol levels, the risk for brain infarcts such as stroke, and to cut out smoking and reduce our risk for heart disease. In turn, dietary changes are key to this. So to reduce our cardiovascular risk factors, we need to reduce our intake of saturated fats and, as Samantha suggested, increase healthy carbohydrates and foods that are rich in antioxidants and omega. Now, we've probably all heard about how do we promote brain health in terms of cognitive function. And so the whole premise of use it or lose it comes to mind. And so what we have to do is to try and make sure that we're staying mentally sharp. And this is not something that you're going to achieve by doing a few Sudokus every day. This is actually, you have to really engage in effortful, taxing, mentally stimulating activities. And that's what the bulk of the literature is saying, that it has to be mentally strenuous. You need to work at these activities to derive benefit from them. So we need to stay curious throughout life, seek out things that are mentally taxing, engage in socially relevant activities as well. And some of the skills that have been suggested to actually potentially augment against pathological processes and promote cognitive aging is taking a digital photography class. One study demonstrated that this was particularly effective, learning a new language, and volunteering in a social capacity. The next one is physical activity, which leads on really nicely from Anne's presentation. And we know that there are a number of trials now that are showing the benefits, even when individuals have been diagnosed with dementia, of engaging in physically aerobic activity. And so we know that this oxygenates the brain. It boosts brain health, physical health, and resilience. It's associated with lower cardiovascular risks, lower risk of cognitive decline, and in some studies it's been suggested that moderately intense physical activity can actually promote the birth of new brain cells, a process known as neurogenesis. As well, incorporating some resistance training and some balance training can mitigate against the risk of falls. So while we want to use it or lose it in terms of cognitive function, you want to move it or lose it in terms of physical activity. And finally, I think this one is really important, and I've dubbed this snooze it or lose it. So again, as a parent of very young babies, the role of sleep, I think, is crucial. I am definitely cognitively sluggish because I'm not getting enough sleep. It's amazing that I'm up here even talking coherently at the moment. So why is sleep important? It is the body's single best way of physically recharging and restoring. We repair during sleep. We consolidate our memories during sleep. This is when you actually lay down, you consolidate all of the experiences that you've had during the day, and they become formed and consolidated into long-term memories. So sleep is crucial for memory function. And also, maybe you might not be aware of this, but when we sleep, the rising levels of amyloid that we all accumulate during our waking day is actually cleaned by the brain's own self-cleaning system. So when we sleep, our brains are cleaning out amyloid buildup that's accumulated during the day. So really, sleep is crucial for mitigating against this insidious process. We know that poor sleep leads to a higher risk of falls, depression, increased risk for dementia, and also difficulty managing a number of physically chronic conditions. So some take-home messages from this talk. I think we need to adopt a much more positive approach to cognitive aging. It does not equal dementia, and there are many things that we can do to mitigate or buffer against our concerns about our cognitive health. Yes, our neural machinery does lose some of the fine-tuning, but there are a number of gains in other functions that we can actually play to and work from. Cognitive reserve, we don't know the recipe that actually buffers against underlying pathological process, but the best evidence to date suggests that it's a combination of staying physically challenged, mentally engaged, socially connected, and making sure that we build in sleep. And as Anne said, you're never too old to start these things. I think we need to start thinking about middle age as being never too young to actually implement some of these strategies to ensure that we do live well into our later years. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Muireann. If that's you when you're feeling a bit sluggish, I'd like to see you when you've got it all together. That was wonderful. If you have a question for Muireann and you are over 35, hashtag Sydney Science Forum now, because you simply won't remember that question 10 minutes from now. Boom, boom, Adam. Tough crowd, move on. Okay, our final speaker. Before we go to that Q&A, but do hit us up on Sydney Science Forum. Keep those questions coming. An Associate Professor of Urban Geography in the School of Geosciences. This man is fascinated with building and creating livable, fair, sustainable cities. the author of several books and articles, and also hosts a fortnightly radio show called Down to Earth on Sydney's wonderful FBI radio. Associate Professor Kurt Iveson.
All right. Now, we find the @ symbol. So, thank you, Adam. I think I'm your oldest panellist, and you'll note that I'm the only person to turn up to the lectern with notes. Maybe it just demonstrates exactly what you're talking about. I might forget something if I don't. So, look, you've just heard 3 fantastic talks by my colleagues here talking about the things that we can do as individuals, the choices that we might be making about diet and physical activity if we want to age well. And of course, as you've heard too, that ageing well that I suppose many of us are aiming for, kids, how's it going, is not just about living longer. It's also about the quality of the lives that we live as we age. And I suppose where I fit into tonight's proceedings is to say to us that that is partly a matter of decisions that we're making as individuals, but that our environments are, of course, shaping the kinds of choices that we can make. And indeed, the fact that we live across vastly different environments, whether it be in rural or urban contexts, the choices that we can make as individuals are constrained depending on which bits of those environments we find ourselves living in. And I guess the goal that many of us would talk about when we're talking about ageing well is about staying healthy and doing so in order to be able to do what we would talk about in the literature as ageing in place. And that is about effectively trying to remain in our communities as we age. It's about maybe staying in the dwelling that we've raised a family in, where we have great relationships with our neighbours and we know the shopkeepers. It might be about downsizing or tree changing, but nonetheless staying out of medical care facilities for as long as we're able to. And what we know from the research is that this is a very strong preference for people who are surveyed over the age of 55, but particularly for over 65s. And it's also, not surprisingly, a preference for governments who see it as a way of minimising the costs associated with looking after ageing populations. Now, when we talk about ageing in place, we know that in the Australian context, for most people, that's going to be about ageing in urban environments. And we see here the statistics that the Greater Sydney Commission has collected about our current ageing population, but also the projections that they're offering of population into the future. And what we can see is that, not surprisingly, across the different districts of our city, the proportion of people over the age of 65 is going to increase. And I want you to take note of the fact, because it'll become important in a moment, that this is fairly evenly distributed across the city. It's true for our denser inner urban areas in the east and in the central business district, as it is also true for the north and south and the west. So the case that I want to make tonight then is that the planning of those urban environments is absolutely going to shape our ability to age in place. And that, secondly, one of the policy and political challenges that we face is that those age-friendly or age-inclusive or just generally inclusive environments are actually unevenly distributed across a city like Sydney. That different groups of people who are ageing have different kinds of access to those inclusive environments, and that they're spatially uneven across the city as well. Now, there are many examples that I could talk about tonight. There's, for instance, fascinating research about food inequality and food deserts across our cities that would speak very directly to what Sam has been talking about. I don't have the time to talk about it all tonight, so I'm going to pick 3 brief examples just to illustrate what I mean about urban environments shaping our ability to age in place. One, talking about housing security. A second, kind of zooming out, as we geographers like to do, scaling back out from the home to the neighbourhood and thinking about neighbourhood public spaces, and then zooming out a little bit more to the sort of urban scale and thinking about how we move between neighbourhoods. So, housing. Wouldn't be a proper Sydney event if we weren't talking about house prices, right? So, a very simple point that I'd like to make is that, of course, a lot of the contention around housing affordability in our city is rightly focused on the prospects for young people for generation rent, as you younger folks are increasingly being referred to, and whether they will ever be able to afford to purchase their own home and stay in that home into older age. But in all of that focus on the young, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that increasingly housing affordability or lack of affordability is actually impacting older people too. And as we see here, private renters aged 65 and over are expected to increase dramatically between 2011 and 2031, and this is the largest tenant population rise of any age group that we're going to see in these decades. And interestingly, we're seeing that already research that's been conducted by my colleague Sophie Marlson in planning here is showing that older people are increasingly accessing share housing as one option if they find themselves in the rental market. And there are apps, not Tinder, other apps that you can find where particularly targeting seniors and share housing options. Now, this is particularly being experienced by certain cohorts of older people, especially, for example, women are finding, because as we know still with gender pay inequality, women earn less over the course of their lives. They have lower savings, lower superannuation into retirement, and so increasingly experiencing this housing insecurity into old age. And one of the most important things then that we can do is think about what the experience of renting is going to be for people as they move into old age. And one of the big problems that we are still facing here in Sydney right now is firstly a decline in the availability of social housing for older people, and secondly the persistence of what are called no grounds evictions in our rental tenancy laws. These are evictions that landlords can enact for no reason at all once a lease is expired. About 8% of renters will experience this at one point in their rental history. Happened to me twice, God damn it. And what happens every time you get moved on from a rental property is that your rent goes up as you move to another property. The expense of moving can really hit you hard if you're on precarious incomes. And we also know that people are less inclined to ask for improvements to their property, which we will need as we age, if they are fearful that if they ask for landlords to spend money on their property, that they will just boot you out and get somebody else in who's not going to ask for them to spend money. So I am one of many academics here at the university that has signed on to Shelter and Homeless New South Wales Make Renting Fair campaign, which is pushing for an end to no grounds evictions in our rental tenancy laws. And Sydney people, I say to you, they've got it in Melbourne. Right? Enough said. We like to compete. Why can't we compete on that? Another thing about our housing markets that we might be thinking of is how much of our housing we're actually building for share housing. Because again, the sort of stereotype is that the housing we should be providing for people to age in place is small apartments for people to downsize in. But if more and more people are renting, and in particular actually enjoying the benefits of share housing and the sociability that comes with it, are we designing new housing to enable that kind of household? Now, number two, let me zoom out from the house and talk about public space for a few minutes. As much as we want people to be able to stay in their homes, we won't want them to be trapped in their homes. We don't want people to feel like they can't access the rest of their neighbourhood because that will increase social isolation, depression, and all sorts of other things that go with that. So the quality of the public spaces in the vicinity of our home are going to be absolutely crucial to our ability to age in place and to do all of the physical activity that Anne and Muireann have just been speaking with you about. So there are some very, very simple things that we know from research can be done to make public spaces more age inclusive and age friendly. They become particularly important because, as we can see here, one of the things that happen to us as we get older is that we get a little bit slower. Not me, but other people maybe, I don't know. But if we're going to access the neighbourhood and be able to have those daily interactions with other people, with shopkeepers, with our friends, family, etc., then making footpath surfaces even and wide makes people be able to do physical activity and walk around their neighbourhoods longer. Building in more places to rest, including places that have thermal comfort so that we're not putting benches in public spaces that are under the baking sun in the middle of summer or freezing cold wind tunnels in the middle of winter. Maximising the legibility of our built environment. So if you do have one of those moments where you're like, hang on, How do I get there again? The built environment is legible and can assist us with that. Building in more public toilets that are easily accessible and friendly and safe and clean to use. Even thinking about the timing of pedestrian crossings and not forcing people who are walking at those slower speeds to have to hustle to get across the street and be more at risk of trips and falls. Very simple things that we can do. And again, geographically speaking, these local neighbourhood issues are typically looked after in a city like Sydney by local government. And what we know is that different local governments across this town are vastly differently resourced to handle these kinds of questions. The City of Sydney, for example, has spent vast resources, the local government area that's just in the central city here, vast resources, brilliantly fixing up many of the public spaces, the parks, the footpaths, etc. But other parts of the city where they don't have the rates coming in from the central business district have far fewer resources to spend on footpaths and these kinds of improvements. So here's a photo that my colleague Christopher Standon's just taken recently of the kind of footpath that people are dealing with all the time. Uneven, narrow, blocked off by cars. These are the kinds of footpaths that clearly we're going to try and avoid. So, finally then, let me talk to you a little bit about how we move, not just within our neighbourhoods, but between our neighbourhoods. And what we know from the research, for instance, the research that's been conducted by the Bureau of Transport Statistics here, is that as we get older, first of all, we tend to travel less in terms of distance, and secondly, we tend to be more dependent on public transportation and walking. So our mode share, you can see kind of growing that public transport and walking, which are the top parts of those graphs, sort of growing as people age. Now, public transport, accessible public transport then is absolutely crucial to enable people to age well in place. Now, here's some work that I did with my colleague Lawrence Troy, mapping the accessibility of public transport across the city, and to try and, I'm a geographer, I've got maps and stuff. To try and interpret these maps for you, the map on the left, if you are living in an area that's shaded pink in that map, then you are living somewhere within 400 metres walk of public transport. But what the map on the right shows you is whether that public transport comes at least every 15 minutes during the day, and we can see that the area of Sydney covered by frequent public transport shrinks rather dramatically. So there's a very basic access question that those maps reveal. But this map I find even more disturbing. This is a map of the train stations just in Sydney that do not have lifts or access to the platform that don't involve you going up and down flights of stairs. And in fact, across the whole metropolitan region of Sydney, if you take in the Central Coast and the mountains and Wollongong train lines too, 130 out of our 307 train stations still do not have accessible platforms. So you may well live within 400 metres walk of one of these nice train stations, but chances are you won't be catching the train because you can't scale the stairs if you're pushing a pram or if you're having trouble dealing with stairs, etc. So 42%, and as much as I hate to editorialise for a minute, this is the state where we're supposed to be able to have it all. Stadiums and, right? Stadiums and lifts on our train stations, people, would be something. So, all right, I'm the social scientist, I can do this, right? We were asked to finish our talks by talking about what you can do, and just as we've heard about the fact that one of the things that we can do to age well is to stay active physically, we might also want to stay active politically and keep pushing for the kind of collective action that will change our urban environments to make them more inclusive. And one of the marvellous things about all of us getting involved in that work is that all of the changes that I've talked about tonight don't just benefit people who are 55 or 65 plus, they benefit everybody. Changes to rental markets, changes to train stations, changes to public spaces, they will benefit people pushing prams, if we're talking about the train station. They will benefit all sorts of people. So identifying those win-win interventions, and when we do the politics, actually identifying the others in the community that might be on our side when we try and make those changes. So here's a little picture of me a few years ago before my hair had gone quite so grey, working through the Sydney Alliance with the community in Arncliffe. That's Azra Ahmed there on the left from the Pakistani Muslim Women's Association. There's a big Pakistani community around Arncliffe, and what they realised is that they were struggling to get together with their colleagues from across the city because their train station didn't have a lift. So they worked with the Alliance and reached out to people of other faiths to parenting groups and to all sorts of other groups in the area, made the case that their station really needed a lift, and here's us celebrating when the Minister for Transport, as she was at the time, Gladys Berejiklian, and the local MP announced that they were going to put a lift in Arncliffe, and I'm happy to say that the people of Arncliffe now do have a wonderful lift. So building alliances across our diversity, identifying those win-win situations, I think is another thing that we can add to the list of how we might age well and age in place. So thank you very much.
Great stuff, Kurt. Kurt, I'll get you to remain on stage while I call up our other speakers as well. Please come up, speakers. I should have mentioned before he spoke, Kurt's actually 137 years old.
Yeah,
and it's just
totally
inspirational stuff to see him out of the house and having a great time. I'm going to ask a couple of questions here. I'm going to throw some of the Twitter questions. We will have a couple of handheld microphones going around to take your questions as well. Just before we go to audience questions, can I quickly say, you've seen those ads on TV where they talk about a financial brother and they go, you have to make clear this television commercial does not constitute financial advice. If you want financial advice, you should speak to a specialist about your particular blah. Same with this. I'd really prefer not to have people asking detailed questions about their own particular medical history and expecting someone in 30 seconds to give them life-changing advice. Anything we say here is not specific medical advice to guarantee you to live to be 180 or anything like that, okay? Please, in all seriousness, don't go asking questions that divulges your or anyone else's medical history and the like. Put your hands in the air and grab the attention of the people with the microphones. When those microphones get to people, I'll take them. I'll ask you a couple of questions just to start us off panel. From Twitter, Sophia asks, Samantha, what are your thoughts on autophagy? Let me start by asking, what is autophagy, Samantha?
So, autophagy or autophagy, as I like to say it,
I'll grab your handheld microphone. That's going to be
learned it a different way, is literally literally comes from the Greek word self-eating. And it's a regulated biological process that our cells do to recycle old material. I mentioned earlier that low-protein diets and longevity pathways help us recycle old material, and this process is actually called autophagy. So we know that fasting, intermittent fasting, reducing calorie intake, all turn on autophagy, which is a very good thing that we want happening in our bodies.
Things like these 5-2 diets.
Yeah, sure. That's just one of them, yeah.
Are they the business? Should we be doing a 5-2 diet?
I actually think fasting is very important. In fact, a lot of the studies now are showing that it's the period that we go without food that stimulates these rejuvenation and these autophagy and all these processes. But one of the things that we asked in our research is that not everyone can fast. It's great. But fasting is not easy, and doing it for a long time is not easy. So is there something else that we can do rather than fasting that can stimulate these processes? And it seems that lowering your protein intake does stimulate these processes to the same extent.
Fantastic. Brain training apps. We've all seen them, things you can get on your phone, you flick your fingers around, it's the next thing meant to be a square or a triangle, and suddenly you're Albert Einstein. I've heard mixed reviews on those things. Do those sort of cognitive stimulations work?
Okay, so I don't want to get pelted by tomatoes from the audience, but I guess the evidence, the empirical evidence that we have, so is that when you complete these brain training programs, you get better at doing the very specific task that the brain training program is training you on. A very comprehensive study published in Nature a few years ago that over 11,000 individuals ranging in age from 18 to older age revealed that there was no transfer of gain from doing these brain training exercises. So that means while you may get better at doing the actual games or the training, it does not actually have any impact on cognitive functioning in general. So generalization from the brain training itself. So basically, you will get better at performing this brain training, but it is not going to boost your cognitive function in any meaningful way.
Quick one to you, and then I'll go to the audience. High-intensity interval. That's all the rage now, the 45-minute workout, the 28-minute workout, the 7-minute workout. Is the literature consistent on whether that sort of stuff can give you the same benefit as walking for 4 hours, etc.? Where are we on HIIT training?
Yeah, it's an emerging area of research. So I think It's certainly showing that there's benefits in terms of diabetes outcomes and cardiovascular health. And so, yeah, I would say go for it. I don't think there's a downside to it. It's the advantage is you can fit something into a small amount of time and you still get benefits. In terms of all of the health outcomes that you get with physical activity, I think it's a bit early to tell whether it has the impact on mental health, for example, and other outcomes, but certainly it's beneficial for some aspects of health. Yep.
Fantastic. The microphone's over there. What would you like to ask?
Hello, yeah, Dr. Samantha. With the lots of veggies and fruit and the sweet potatoes, is that going to give us enough iron? Like, can we get enough iron from that?
So yeah, you're absolutely right, and this is why it's important that I emphasize we're not saying a no protein diet. The recommended guidelines is 15 to 25% protein, but that is a really large range. So going as low as 15%, you could still get the minimum requirements for micronutrients. In fact, 10% is enough according to NHMRC guidelines for our physiological processes. But in the Australian food environment, eating a 10% protein diet doesn't get you those minerals and vitamins that we need. For example, iron. Yeah. That's a good question. My colleague Rosie over there might have some food displays for you outside. So if you go visit her booth, she can help you figure out what that is. And she is an accredited dietitian. I am not. So best to take advice from her.
Always one of the highlights of these forums, if this is your first one, we have a series of displays and exhibitions outside that we'll be moving to in just a second. The microphone on this side of the room is just there. What would you like to ask?
Hello, is it on? Okay. I'm just wondering if there's been any research done on the effects of prolonged screen time, like, for example, using your mobile phone or being in front of the computer for too long. Obviously, the blue light affects your circadian rhythms and therefore affects your sleep, but I'm wondering if there's been any research done on the other effects of excessive screen usage, whether that has an aging effect.
Fantastic. Could those brain training apps actually be killing your brain?
I think that's a really good question, and it's something that we can't answer definitively at the moment because we're on the first wave, really, of this being this screen generation. In general, what we would advise is that you should try and limit your screen time for a number of reasons. That basically the brain was not designed to be bombarded by information constantly. We need to have time where we actually restore and recharge, and that can be from engaging in things like daydreaming or mind wandering, but also the screen time implies that you're not actually being physically active as well. And I think there are a number of different intersecting problems with constantly being on devices in terms of even social engagement. And some people have had studies saying that children are not acquiring language as efficiently when they go to school because they've been on screens at home. So there's myriad different factors that we need to consider. And I think it's going to be interesting over the coming years to see what the product of this shift in how we're interacting with screens, what that reveals to us.
You hear that, kids? Microphone's over there. What would you like to ask, sir?
I was going to say that just last night with the television news, we've had the head of the NRMA endorsing the importance and value of and direction of electric cars. So normally, up till now, we have generally thought that's a good thing for a lot of reasons instead of petrol and diesel. But if the best way that we can get decent physical exercise, on footpaths near and
I want to get to the question, so we're running out of time.
Well, what I'm saying is, do you have a strategy for dealing with the new electric cars will solve our problems?
Code in particular, design for city access, transport, mobile people.
Yep. So look, I mean, the question for me is precisely about how we're facilitating active transport as a mode of transport in our cities. And as you say, what's interesting in that debate and where we're at in that debate right now in Australia is that there is a lot of focus on technologies. So there's a lot of focus on electric vehicles, there's focus on autonomous vehicles and how they might transform our transport mix. But in terms of active transport, I guess we could also be thinking about even the way that electric bikes encouraging active transport for much deeper into our lives and enabling us to cycle longer. And again, as we need to focus on what we might be doing to build in infrastructures for electric cars in our cities, we might want to be thinking about the docking stations and the infrastructures that might support active forms of transport like cycling that have the environmental benefits but also the health benefits that my colleagues have talked about. So.
Fantastic. We've got time for 2 more audience questions. I'll take where the microphones currently are. That's probably all we've got time for. Fire away, no? Yes.
So we spoke about the benefits of sleep for your brain to recover and heal. So if I don't get enough sleep, could I offset it with naps?
Napping, and also if you've got anything on, what's the jury out on, I don't get enough sleep during the week, so just on Sunday I'll sleep until 1 in the afternoon. Can you catch up sleep on credit and that sort of stuff? What are your thoughts on sleep?
So we're talking about sort of mitigating against a sleep debt. That's what we're saying. So I had a nap today before I came in. I'll put my hand up because I was very tired. But basically, we want to make sure we're not getting into a position where it's a cumulative. You know, if you're doing 5 days a week where you're not getting enough sleep, that you cannot offset that by getting one good power nap in or sleeping in on the weekend. So it should be consistent. We should be building sleep in. You know, we have 24 hours in a day. We should be prioritizing sleep as much as we prioritize other things, such as checking our phones or, you know, prioritizing work. And we really should be trying to aim for 7 to 8 hours consistently a night.
At the back of the room, what would you like to ask, mate?
I have a question about consuming saturated fat. My understanding is when you're consuming saturated fat, you're consuming both good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. The good cholesterol is good because it helps you get rid of some of the bad cholesterol. So my question is simply, is consuming saturated fat really as bad as people make it out to be?
As the jury on saturated fat.
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, especially, yeah, I don't know, do you have any unsaturated fat? Well, I know that for sure that recently it's been shown that perhaps, you know, these campaigns to just eat butter, as opposed to butter was bad, it's not bad anymore. It's safe to say, I think, that going with unsaturated fats like olive oils is still going to be healthier than saturated fats, but perhaps we've demonized it to a greater extent that we should have. Eliminating any food or any food group is never recommended, and I certainly wouldn't, I mean, if you eat animal protein, there's going to be saturated fat in there, so it's not all bad.
Fantastic, and your mate, the dietitian, is out there if they want to ask a little bit more as well. So,
She knows all about saturated fat. You should have to talk to her.
we are going to wrap it up there. Can we please give our panel a massive round of applause? Highlights of the Sydney Science Forum is the displays and activities that are available out there now in the foyer. A couple of other items are open now. You can book yourself into Wednesday the 29th of May, the Light Side, Illuminating Life with Dr. Alice Motion and Professor Elizabeth New. And we've also got, at the Seymour Centre Mile, like Dr. Karl Grzelnicki, Wednesday the 5th of June will be doing his one on vital science. We handed out cards as you came in tonight. We'd love your feedback on what you enjoyed, anything we could do better with the forum. We'd really, really like to know. Get outside, get involved in the activities. One more round of applause for our panel, please.